It started on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day where the sun rises over a quiet suburban street and everything seems predictable. That illusion of normalcy shattered the moment I opened my mailbox and discovered a thick envelope from the Homeowners Association. The envelope was crisp, official, and undeniably threatening. Its contents would set off a chain of events that would engulf my life for the next several weeks. Inside, the letter bore an unmistakable headline: a $10,000 fine for my backyard shed. The fine wasn't just steep, it was absurd. I'd built the shed months earlier, following what I believed were all HOA guidelines, meticulously measuring setbacks, ensuring the height was within limits, and even checking paint colors against the approved palette. Yet, according to the letter, my shed violated multiple community aesthetic rules that, until that moment, I had never even heard of. The letter cited obscure clauses about siding texture, roof pitch, and even the orientation of the door. I reread the letter, convinced I must have misunderstood something. But no, the fine was real, and the HOA expected it paid immediately. It wasn't just the financial burden, it was the principle of it. My shed was functional, tasteful, and built entirely by my own hands, yet somehow it was deemed an offense. The first feeling that washed over me was disbelief. How could a homeowners association wield such authority over a project that was clearly on my private property? I thought back to all the interactions I had with the board in the past. Meetings where they seemed cordial, rules that seemed reasonable, neighborhood standards that I had always followed. And yet, here I was, staring down a massive fine with an association that had no room for explanation or dialogue. In the following days, I started gathering every piece of evidence that could justify my shed. Photos from every angle, construction receipts, timestamps from when the materials were purchased, and copies of emails where board members had approved other similar projects. The more I dug, the more I realized the HOA's claim was not just unfair, it was baseless. My shed complied with all visible rules, yet the fine stood. The HOA's overreach was blatant, and their claim flimsy at best. As I reviewed the documents, another thought took hold. I was not going to pay this fine quietly. The HOA might have assumed that residents would simply comply when threatened with money and bureaucracy, but I wasn't most residents. There was an unmistakable arrogance in their tone, a sense that authority itself was enough to intimidate. I refused to be intimidated. But I knew that confronting them directly would be more complicated than simply saying no. Their rules were convoluted, their meetings opaque, and their penalties severe. Any misstep could cost me thousands of dollars, or worse, years of legal headaches, so I began planning. My first step was research. Every clause of the HOA bylaws, every previous violation issued to neighbors, every board meeting record I could obtain. The goal was simple: uncover inconsistencies, errors, and any procedural mistakes they might have made. The more I read, the more it became apparent that the HOA had a track record of arbitrary fines, inconsistent enforcement, and often bending rules to suit the whims of individual board members. I realized that this wasn't just about my shed. It was about a systemic problem that many homeowners had quietly suffered under for years. With this insight, my approach shifted from reactive to strategic. I wouldn't just contest the fine, I would turn the tables. The HOA prided itself on rules, on the image of control, but it had left itself exposed. Their rigid adherence to the letter of their own policies meant they were vulnerable to scrutiny. Any flaw, any procedural oversight could be used against them. And in the coming weeks, I would exploit every single one. In the meantime, tension built within the neighborhood. Word of the fines spread quietly, then with growing curiosity. Neighbors began whispering about the overreach of the board, about the outrageous nature of the $10,000 demand. Some sympathized, some laughed, and others quietly wondered if anyone could really stand up to the association without consequences. But I felt energized rather than fearful. I knew the path ahead would be challenging, but the more I realized the HOA had overstepped, the more confident I became that they had underestimated me. That first week ended with me staring at the shed I had worked on tirelessly, the letter threatening financial ruin lying on my workbench. The sun set over the quiet suburban street, casting long shadows over the freshly painted siding. In that moment I made a silent vow. The HOA might have tried to intimidate me, but they had inadvertently awakened a determination they had never anticipated. The battle over a backyard shed had just begun, and the story that would unfold would not be one of quiet compliance. It would be one of exposure, strategy, and eventual vindication. The next step was clear: gather evidence, document every interaction, and start building a case that would force the HOA to answer for their overreach. But as I began laying out the materials on my desk, I realized the stakes were higher than I had initially imagined. This wasn't just about money. It was about principle, about power, and about showing that even in the face of an organized authority, an individual could reclaim control. And with that realization, Chapter 1 closes, leaving the stage set for a confrontation that would grow more intense with each passing day. The first few days after receiving the fine were a whirlwind of research and analysis. I immersed myself in the HOA's governing documents, poring over pages of bylaws, covenants, and obscure amendments that seemed written to confuse rather than clarify. At first glance, it was a tangled mess of legalese, dotted with vague language about community aesthetics, structural conformity, and board discretion. But the more I read, the more I realized something crucial. Hidden within the dense text were loopholes and inconsistencies that the board had either ignored or deliberately left unpoliced. I created a detailed spreadsheet, listing every clause that could possibly apply to sheds, fences, outbuildings, and accessory structures. Each line item included cross-references to previous fines, documented approvals, and contradictory language within the bylaws. What became apparent quickly was that the HOA had never applied these rules consistently. Some neighbors had sheds taller than mine, painted in unconventional colors, and even placed closer to property lines. And yet, they were never fined. Others had added similar structures and received only mild warnings. The hypocrisy was glaring. Next, I turned to precedent. I requested copies of past board meeting minutes and violation notices, a process that involved repeated calls, emails, and subtle hints that I knew my rights as a property owner. Eventually, I received a stack of documents revealing patterns of favoritism, selective enforcement, and procedural mistakes. Many fines had been issued without proper notification, signatures were missing from official documents, and in some cases, deadlines were miscalculated. The more I dug, the more I realized that the HOA's armor of authority was fragile. It relied on the assumption that homeowners would be intimidated into submission. I also discovered something even more valuable. Certain procedural rules the board was required to follow had been completely overlooked in my case. For example, the HOA bylaws specified a multi-step process for violations. First, a written notice with a clear explanation of the infraction, then a period for compliance or appeal, followed by a formal vote before a fine could be levied. None of this had happened. My letter had arrived as if out of nowhere, demanding immediate payment. In short, they had skipped critical steps, leaving their fine legally and procedurally vulnerable. With this knowledge, I began drafting my plan. It wasn't enough to simply dispute the fine. I needed to create a situation where the HOA's errors were undeniable, publicly documented, and impossible to ignore. Every photograph, email, and document I had gathered became a piece of a puzzle that, when assembled correctly, would expose their overreach. I started visualizing the sequence of actions I would take, mapping out how to force the board to confront their mistakes without giving them room to maneuver. Meanwhile, the shed itself became more than just a physical structure. It became a symbol, Every nail I had hammered, every board I had painted, represented not only the labor I had invested, but also the principle I was defending. I photographed the shed from multiple angles, noting its precise measurements, alignment with the property line, and compliance with all stated regulations. I even created a time-lapse record of the construction process, highlighting the care and planning that had gone into the project. This documentation would later serve as undeniable proof that the HOA's claim was unfounded. As I worked, I began observing the subtle reactions of the neighborhood. Curiosity spread like wildfire. Neighbors peeked over fences, whispered at community gatherings, and occasionally asked questions about the fine. Some offered advice, often from second-hand experiences with the board, while others shared their frustrations about fines or arbitrary rules they had quietly endured. It became evident that the HOA had underestimated how quickly word could spread when someone decided not to play by the rules. I also realized that timing would be critical. The board met monthly, and any action I took needed to align with their schedule. I had to build my case meticulously, layer by layer, before presenting it at the next meeting. One misstep could result in a dismissal of my appeal or even escalate the fine. I treated every interaction as a strategic move in a larger game, anticipating the board's reactions and preparing counters for every possible argument they might raise. By the end of the week, my plan had taken shape. I knew which documents to submit, which photographs would carry the most weight, and which procedural violations to highlight. I'd also begun drafting a letter that was firm but professional, one that would demand accountability while leaving no room for the board to deflect blame. I felt a mix of anticipation and determination. The process was slow, deliberate, and strategic, but I was confident that when executed correctly, it would leave the HOA exposed for all their errors. And yet, even as the pieces fell into place, there was a lingering tension. I knew the board would resist, that they would likely attempt to intimidate or confuse me, and that the next weeks would test my patience and resolve. But I had already committed. There was no turning back. The shed, the fine, and the board's arrogance had become the spark for something much larger, a confrontation that would force accountability, not just for me, but for anyone who had suffered quietly under arbitrary rules. As Chapter 2 comes to a close, the foundation is laid, evidence is gathered, loopholes identified, and strategy in place. The stage is set for a confrontation that will push the HOA to respond, and the battle over a backyard shed is poised to escalate into a fight the board never expected. The following weeks were a delicate dance of preparation, observation, and subtle maneuvers. I knew that when I finally presented my case, it had to be flawless, leaving the HOA with no legitimate path to continue their $10,000 demand. Every email, every document, and every photograph had to be organized with precision, because once the confrontation began, there would be no room for mistakes. I started by drafting a formal appeal letter, referencing the exact clauses the board had violated in issuing the fine. I cited procedural errors, inconsistent enforcement, and precedents from other residents' cases. Each argument was meticulously supported by evidence. I even included a timeline of my shed construction, showing that it adhered to every known guideline. The language was firm but professional, leaving no question that I knew my rights and had thoroughly researched the matter. Meanwhile, I continued documenting everything. I recorded board notices, saved copies of every email, and made detailed notes of interactions with HOA staff and board members. I also began discreetly gathering anecdotal evidence from neighbors who shared their own experiences with inconsistent fines and selective enforcement. It became clear that the board had created a culture of fear, relying on the intimidation of homeowners to maintain control. But this time, that control would be challenged. On the day of the official board meeting, I arrived early, bringing a complete binder of my research. I had anticipated objections, counter-arguments, and even personal attacks from board members. I knew they might try to dismiss my evidence as irrelevant or exaggerate minor technicalities. That's why every piece of documentation was cross-referenced, time-stamped, and organized with care. The goal was to make it impossible for them to ignore the truth. As the meeting began, the board attempted to assert their usual authority, citing regulations in a condescending tone and assuming I would falter under pressure. But I remained calm, letting the weight of my preparation speak for itself. I presented my binder methodically, highlighting each procedural error, inconsistent enforcement, and violation of their own bylaws. I carefully walked through the timeline, demonstrating that my shed had been built in complete compliance and that the $10,000 fine was entirely unwarranted. The room's atmosphere shifted subtly as I spoke. Board members who had been confident moments before began to fidget, glance at their notes, and whisper among themselves. The more I laid out the evidence, the more it became evident that they had underestimated me. What had seemed like an insurmountable authority was suddenly exposed as a flawed, bureaucratic system vulnerable to scrutiny. I could sense the tension, the discomfort, and the realization that their usual tactics of intimidation would not work. Neighbors, who had quietly observed the meeting, began to murmur among themselves. Some whispered encouragement, while others leaned in, captivated by the unfolding drama. The HOA had always relied on the silence of residents, assuming compliance through fear. Now that silence had broken, and the board's veneer of control began to crack. The power dynamics had shifted, and the room was acutely aware of it. By the end of the meeting, the board was forced to acknowledge the procedural mistakes they had made. They could not dispute the photographic evidence, the documented inconsistencies, or the meticulous timeline of my shed construction. It was clear that the fine had no legitimate basis, and their authority had been challenged in a way they had not anticipated. Though they attempted to maintain composure, it was evident that their confidence had been shaken. Leaving the meeting, I felt a sense of vindication, but also recognized that this was only the beginning. The HOA could still attempt to appeal their own mistakes, delay action, or retaliate in subtle ways. The victory was significant, but it required careful follow-up to ensure that the fine was formally rescinded and that they acknowledged their procedural errors. The next phase of the plan would focus on documenting their acknowledgement, securing compliance, and ensuring accountability. As the day ended, I stood in my backyard, looking at the shed bathed in the late afternoon sunlight. It was more than a simple structure. It had become a symbol of resilience, preparation, and the power of knowledge. The confrontation had begun, and the board had been exposed for what they were, an organization relying on fear, selective enforcement, and procedural mistakes to maintain control. Chapter 3 closes with the first real victory in sight, but the story is far from over. The HOA had been challenged, their authority questioned, and their errors revealed. The next chapters would see the consequences unfold, neighbors reacting, and the board forced to navigate the fallout of their own missteps. The shed had sparked more than a dispute. It had ignited a movement for accountability within the community, setting the stage for a dramatic resolution. After the confrontation, the aftermath was immediate and tense. The HOA board, accustomed to unquestioned authority, suddenly found themselves on the defensive. Internal emails leaked hints of panic among members, with discussions about damage control, potential loopholes, and ways to regain their credibility. Their usual calm, authoritative demeanor had evaporated, replaced by uncertainty and disarray. In the days following the meeting, I received a flurry of communications from the HOA. Unlike before, these messages were cautious, polite to the point of absurdity, and strangely conciliatory. It was evident that the board had recognized the seriousness of my evidence and the strength of my procedural arguments. They were no longer issuing threats. Instead, they seemed hesitant, weighing every word as if a single misstep could further expose them. During this period, I continued to document everything meticulously. Every email, every phone call, and every meeting summary became a part of my growing case file. My focus was clear: ensure that the HOA could not reverse course, reissue the fine, or undermine the progress I had achieved. Each document was time-stamped and cross-referenced, creating a paper trail that left no room for ambiguity or deceit. The neighborhood, too, had begun to take notice. Word of the confrontation spread quickly, with neighbors expressing surprise, admiration, and relief. Many had long suffered under arbitrary fines, inconsistent rules, and the subtle coercion of the board, but few had dared to challenge the system. My case became a symbol of what could be achieved through careful preparation, strategy, and persistence. The HOA's vulnerability was no longer a secret. It was a public spectacle, and the board was painfully aware of it. In response, the HOA attempted to regain control. They convened emergency meetings, drafted statements, and sought legal opinions to justify their previous actions. Yet every attempt seemed to backfire. The more they scrutinized the situation, the more procedural errors and inconsistencies came to light. Their advisors pointed out missed notifications, improper voting procedures, and ambiguous rule interpretations, errors that would have been overlooked if not for the meticulous documentation I had provided. Recognizing their position, the board began to issue vague communications, promising review and further consideration while avoiding any acknowledgement of wrongdoing. This delay tactic, however, only reinforced their vulnerability. I had anticipated this, ensuring that every communication was logged and every promise of review was documented. The HOA's attempts to stall, intimidate, or confuse me were ineffective against a case built on irrefutable evidence and methodical preparation. Meanwhile, the shed itself had become a neighborhood landmark. People walked past, observing the structure with curiosity, admiration, and in some cases envy. It was no longer just a backyard building. It had become a symbol of resistance against arbitrary authority. Social media buzzed with discussions, photos circulated, and neighbors shared tips on standing up to fines or challenging overreach. My single shed had ignited a small movement of awareness and empowerment within the community. Despite the growing attention, I remained focused. Every step had to be precise. Any miscalculation could give the HOA leverage. I reviewed their bylaws again, anticipating their next moves, preparing responses, and ensuring that each action I took further strengthened my position. The fine was still technically in place, but the board's credibility was crumbling. Their once feared authority had been reduced to cautious, uncertain gestures. By the end of this chapter, it was clear that the HOA was scrambling. They had underestimated the power of preparation, evidence, and principled resistance. The battle over a $10,000 shed fine had evolved into a test of accountability, procedural integrity, and transparency. The board could no longer act unchecked. Every decision would be scrutinized, every communication documented, and every action weighed against the mountain of evidence I had meticulously assembled. As Chapter 4 closes, the stage is set for the next dramatic phase. The board must confront their mistakes publicly. Neighbors become more involved, and the final resolution begins to take shape. The shed remains at the center of the storm, a quiet testament to patience, strategy, and unwavering resolve. The momentum I had built over the past weeks finally forced the HOA into action. After repeated requests, documented communications, and the undeniable evidence I had gathered, the board was compelled to schedule a formal review meeting to address the fine. Unlike previous gatherings, this one carried a weight of accountability that the HOA could no longer avoid. The usual air of authority was replaced by a tense and cautious atmosphere, as every board member knew that their missteps were about to be laid bare. The review process began with formal introductions and procedural acknowledgements. I presented my binder, organized meticulously with charts, photographs, email correspondences, and legal references. Each section highlighted the board's errors, inconsistencies, and failure to adhere to their own rules. What had been a simple fine now became a full exposure of the HOA's administrative shortcomings. The contrast between the meticulous documentation and the board's hasty, error-filled procedures was stark, leaving little room for denial. Neighbors attended the meeting in greater numbers than usual, curious to witness the confrontation firsthand. Many had quietly suffered under arbitrary fines and selective enforcement, and they now watched as one resident held the board accountable with clarity and precision. Their presence added a layer of public scrutiny that the HOA had never experienced before. The tension in the room was palpable, a mix of anticipation, apprehension, and excitement. As the review progressed, the board struggled to respond. Each argument I made was supported by evidence, exposing flaws in their reasoning and errors in procedure. Attempted defenses, claims that prior approvals were irrelevant or that the rules had always been applied consistently, fell flat under scrutiny. I referenced past violations, documented approvals for other residents, and procedural missteps in their communications. Each point weakened their position further, demonstrating not only the baselessness of the fine, but also the systemic issues within the board's enforcement practices. By the midpoint of the meeting, it became evident that the $10,000 fine could not be justified. Board members exchanged nervous glances, realizing that their authority had been publicly challenged and their credibility diminished. Attempts to salvage the situation through vague statements or procedural justifications were futile. The evidence was clear, the documentation irrefutable, and the neighborhood watching. The power dynamic had shifted decisively, from intimidation to accountability. The board ultimately voted, albeit reluctantly, to rescind the fine. This action marked the first formal acknowledgement of their error. In addition to voiding the $10,000 demand, they were required to issue a written apology, citing procedural oversights and the need for improved enforcement consistency. This acknowledgement, though brief, was a symbolic victory, demonstrating that homeowners could hold the association accountable when evidence and strategy were applied correctly. The resolution had effects beyond my individual case. Word spread rapidly throughout the neighborhood about the overturning of the fine. Homeowners who had felt powerless now saw an example of principled resistance leading to concrete results. Conversations at community gatherings shifted from passive complaints to active discussions about compliance, fairness, and enforcement. The board's authority, once unquestioned, was now measured against transparency and procedural integrity. As the meeting concluded, I reflected on the journey that had led to this point. What began as a seemingly simple dispute over a backyard shed had evolved into a challenge of governance, accountability, and homeowner empowerment. The HOA had underestimated the importance of thorough documentation, neighbor involvement, and strategic planning, and their overreach had been exposed. My shed, once a target of intimidation, had become a symbol of resilience and empowerment. With the fine rescinded and the board publicly acknowledging their mistakes, the immediate battle was won. Yet the experience left a lasting impression on the community. Neighbors were now more informed, more confident in asserting their rights, and more vigilant about arbitrary fines and selective enforcement. The HOA had learned, albeit reluctantly, that authority could not be exercised without accountability, and that one well-prepared homeowner could set a precedent for fairness and transparency. Chapter 5 closes with a sense of triumph but also reflection. The conflict over the $10,000 shed fine had reached its resolution, yet the broader lessons about power, accountability, and community vigilance had only begun to resonate. The stage was set for the final chapter, where the aftermath solidifies, lessons are cemented, and the shed stands as a lasting emblem of determination and strategy. With the $10,000 fine formally rescinded, a sense of relief and vindication washed over me. The shed, once the focal point of conflict, now stood as a quiet monument to strategy, perseverance, and resilience. But the story didn't end with a single victory. The experience had sparked a chain reaction, changing the way the community viewed the HOA and its authority. What had started as a personal dispute evolved into a lesson in accountability for the entire neighborhood. In the weeks following the board's acknowledgement, residents approached me with gratitude, curiosity, and newfound confidence. They shared stories of fines they had quietly paid, rules they had followed out of fear, and frustrations they had long suppressed. Conversations shifted from casual complaints to serious discussions about governance, transparency, and the rights of homeowners. The shed had become more than a structure. It had become a symbol of empowerment, demonstrating that one individual, armed with diligence and knowledge, could challenge systemic overreach. The HOA itself underwent subtle yet noticeable changes. Meetings became more transparent, with agendas circulated in advance and procedural steps carefully observed. Enforcement of rules became more consistent, and board members were forced to acknowledge that arbitrary fines could no longer be issued without scrutiny. While old habits lingered in some corners, the community now held the board accountable, demanding documentation, justification, and fairness in every decision. The landscape of power had shifted. I also realized the broader implications of the experience. Many homeowners across the country face similar struggles with overreaching associations, fines, and selective enforcement. My story, though centered on a backyard shed, offered a blueprint for resistance. Document everything, understand your rights, anticipate every move, and leverage community support. The impact was not just personal, it was instructional, showing that knowledge, preparation, and patience could transform fear into power. Reflecting on the shed itself, I appreciated it in a new light. Every nail, every coat of paint, every hour of labor represented more than effort. It represented principle. The shed had survived bureaucratic overreach, served as a catalyst for community dialogue, and stood as a testament to what could be achieved when one refuses to be intimidated. It had become a landmark, not only physically but symbolically, embodying the idea that authority must answer to accountability. The neighborhood, once quiet and deferential, now buzzed with a new energy. Residents attended meetings with questions, neighbors collaborated on compliance tips, and discussions about property improvements became exercises in transparency rather than fear. The HOA, for all its structure and rules, was no longer an unquestioned authority. It had been reminded that power is conditional, dependent on fairness, clarity, and accountability. As the months passed, I continued to monitor developments, ensuring that the board upheld the lessons learned from the confrontation. The shed remained untouched, fully compliant, and admired by all who passed. Each time I looked at it, I was reminded of the journey, from the shock of an outrageous fine to the meticulous planning, confrontation, and ultimate vindication. What had begun as a battle over a small structure had grown into a story of empowerment, justice, and transformation. The saga concluded not with dramatic gestures or revenge, but with a quiet, undeniable victory. The HOA had been forced to acknowledge its mistakes. The fine was gone, and the neighborhood had been awakened to the importance of vigilance and principle. In the end, it was a story about more than a shed. It was about courage, preparation, and the power of standing firm in the face of authority. Chapter 6 closes with the shed bathed in sunlight, a symbol of triumph and lasting change. The neighborhood has shifted, the HOA is held accountable, and a single homeowner's determination has left a permanent mark on the community. The story of the $10,000 shed fine serves as a lasting reminder. With strategy, evidence, and unwavering resolve, even the most overreaching authority can be turned on its head.